I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, my topic is Churchill and his atrocities. On my last video, which was Uns Corbett and the Unnecessary War, I got such great comments in which people recommended different links that have added a lot to my knowledge. So I'm going to be talking about one of those in particular today. But first, I want to look at a comment that I got on my YouTube. Let me read it to you. Engelbert42 wrote, "Obviously, there are lesser-known details to every story, and with increased detail, the black and white picture gets more and more shades of gray. But it is most unlikely that any amount of detail can flip around the whole picture. Drawing an alternative history utterly incompatible with what is known as irrefutable fact is certainly a way to get one thrown out of any self-respecting publishing house. Unfortunately, internet platforms of today allow everyone to create and publish absurdly misinformed or outright malicious content." I replied that in my experience, irrefutable facts don't require censorship to keep them from being refuted. Did all of these highly reputable historians with multiple publications, university professorships, titles bestowed by royalty, suddenly forget how to research when it came to the world wars? I sent him to my Substack to read, particularly the comments, to which he answered, "Too long, didn't read. Nobody is getting disappeared for fabulating pieces of alternative history, but people won't take you seriously once you start to deny or relativize the atrocities committed by literal Nazis." This had the intended effect of making me feel like a kid admonished by a grown-up, until I remembered that there are 2,000 of you right now who have chosen to hear what I have to say. And this is after a lifetime of literally no one, and I mean no one, taking me seriously. I always look at the profiles of new subscribers to see what they're writing and what they're reading, and there are some seriously smart people listening to me, like you. And I suspect I'm not the only one who hasn't been taken seriously before. It is darn hard to hold on to what you know and not get a little shrill when you're screaming into the void, as Simulation Commander would say. So I'm no longer invisible because you see me. And you don't give that knowing little eye roll to your friend when I talk about graphene and chemtrails. Instead, you say, "Yes, and?" No matter what happens in this crazy future that we're going into, that level of sanity can't be taken away from me. I know that what I'm saying is true because you're seeing the same thing. And we may disagree, and we do, but it's at that growing tip of people who are having a real dialogue, who are not looking to put each other down, but who are trying to build on a solid foundation of saying, well, here's how we decide what's true and what's not true. Let's look at that and then see where we can go from there. This was recently discussed by Kathleen Devaney in her essay on weaving, where she said, "The new reality emerging comes at the undoing of the old." How do we unweave the truth from the lies? I'll go back to some of my detractors' phrases. He says, "Most unlikely that any amount of detail can flip around the whole picture." What else could flip the picture other than details that contradict the official narrative? To assume that the gist is right and dismiss details that contradict it is uncritical thinking. If even one detail is found that gives the lie to the whole, the whole needs to be reconsidered. Then, an alternative history utterly incompatible with what is known as irrefutable fact. To start with the basics, history draws from primary sources, the same way investigative journalism does. So if primary sources are utterly incompatible with what is known, it's the latter that needs to go. Then, a way to get one thrown out of any self-respecting publishing house. If the authorities reject you, it must be the fault of your scholarship, even if you were at the top of your profession before. Absurdly misinformed or outright malicious content. This is the veiled anti-Semitism attack. If I'm questioning the World War II narrative, I must be anti-Semitic. Nobody is getting disappeared for fabulating pieces of alternate history. Exactly. You can fabulate all the historical nonsense you want, but only when you write the truth do you fall out of a second-story hospital window. And last, once you start to deny or relativize the atrocities committed by literal Nazis, what is relativize the atrocities, and who are the literal Nazis? Before an act can be deemed atrocious, do we need to know who did it and to whom? I think atrocities are not relative, but absolute, whether done by Churchill or Hitler, and that's my focus today. I will also add that men do not say to other men, if you say things like this, people won't take you seriously. That's what men who assume their own authority say in a patronizing way to women who they're just trying to help, poor little misled thing. Let me show you how the real world works and how to get taken seriously. I know you don't know these things, so I would chalk this up as another example of toxic masculinity. Among the excellent commenters on my last episode was Tanzenkran, who recommended 3 more articles by Ron Unz, all of which were great. My only problem with Unz is that he's already so pithy and succinct that it is really hard to summarize him, because how else are you going to flip the official narrative except with a wealth of details? And that's what he gives. So I'm going to be again relying on lengthy quotes. Hence the glasses. In this episode, I'll be focusing on the interview of Ron Unz by Mike Whitney called Churchill, Hitler, the Holocaust, and the War in Ukraine. Mike starts by asking whether the onerous conditions imposed after World War I made World War II inevitable, not Hitler. Unz points out that the Germans were tricked into the Versailles Treaty. He writes, Germany had been very successful during the early years of the First World War, repeatedly defeating the Russians while occupying portions of northern France. But nevertheless, its leaders then sought to end the horrible mutual slaughter in 1916 by proposing a peace without winners or losers. However, most of the Allied leadership harshly rejected any peace negotiations and were instead determined to continue the war until Germany was defeated and permanently crippled. A couple of years later, after America had entered the war, Germany agreed to an armistice, an end to the fighting, on the basis of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which seemed to offer a fair peace without a victory for either side. But this turned out to be a bait-and-switch operation, since once Germany had withdrawn its troops from French territory and given up its powerful naval forces, the Allies then imposed a brutal starvation blockade upon the weakened country, inflicting many hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, until the new German government finally accepted very harsh peace terms. These included the dismemberment and occupation of portions of their country, permanent military weakness, and acceptance of the entire guilt of the war, as well as paying gigantic future financial reparations to the victorious Allies. To assess a fairly comprehensive appraisal of the origins and policies of National Socialist Germany by one of Britain's most prominent historians of that era, Unz turns to Sir Arthur Bryant, who was an eminent historian and a favorite of Churchill's. In the early 1940s, a few months after the start of World War II, he published Unfinished Victory on the lead-up to the war. However, soon after, there was a crackdown on dissident voices, and he attempted to remove all copies from circulation. This saved his reputation and career when the tide turned. Finding a copy available at archive.org, Unz writes, "Writing before the official version of historical events had been rigidly determined, Bryant describes Germany's very difficult domestic situation between the two world wars, its problematic relationship with its tiny Jewish minority, and the circumstances behind the rise of Hitler, providing a very different perspective on these important events than what we usually read in our standard textbooks. Among other surprising facts, he notes that although Jews were just 1% of the total population, even 5 years after Hitler had come to power and implemented various anti-Semitic policies, they still apparently owned something like a third of the real property in that country, with the great bulk of these vast holdings having been acquired from desperate, starving Germans in the terrible years of the early 1920s. Thus, much of Germany's 99% German population had recently been dispossessed of the assets they had built up over generations. Bryant also candidly notes the enormous Jewish presence in the leadership of the communist movements that had temporarily seized power after World War I, both in major portions of Germany and in nearby Hungary. This was an ominous parallel to the overwhelmingly Jewish Bolsheviks who had gained control of Russia and then butchered or expelled that country's traditional Russian and German ruling elites, and therefore a major source of Nazi fears. Mike then asks, "We've all been taught that Britain's Neville Chamberlain caved in to Hitler's demands on the annexation of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, which in turn fueled Hitler's lust for global conquest. But was that really what happened? And was appeasement really such a bad idea, or should the European leaders have accepted that Versailles was a disaster from the get-go and agreed to Hitler's demands to restore Germany's original borders?" Unz replies, "Czechoslovakia had been established as an important strategic ally for France to use against Germany, geographically serving as an ideal staging ground for bombing attacks, almost amounting to an unsinkable aircraft carrier directly jutting into the heart of its German neighbor. Since the country was intentionally designed to threaten Germany, the overwhelmingly German Sudetenland region had been included so as to strengthen its geographical border defenses. The Germans were actually the second largest nationality within Czechoslovakia, so the very name amounted to dishonest propaganda, and something like Czecho-Germania might have been a little more accurate. One of Hitler's main goals was to free the suppressed German populations of Central Europe and reunite them with their German homeland, and this included the more than 3 million Sudeten Germans. The Czech government was also quite friendly with Stalin's Soviet Union, and therefore seemed a particularly menacing potential military threat, a possible future base for Soviet attacks against Germany. Hitler gradually rebuilt Germany's strength, and by March 1938 managed to reunite his country with the Germans of Austria, accomplished with the overwhelmingly enthusiastic support of the latter. He then demanded that the Sudeten Germans be freed by the Czechs and allowed to unify with Germany as well, being willing to potentially risk a wider European war with the British, French, and Soviets on that issue. To avoid this, the leaders of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy together negotiated an agreement at Munich, allowing the Sudeten Germans to secede and join Germany. This peace agreement was wildly popular across nearly all of Europe. However, once the Germans had been allowed to secede from Czechoslovakia, the Slovaks soon did the same, establishing their own independent state of Slovakia, just as happened once again in 1993. And the entire country fell apart. At that point, Poland also grabbed a piece of disputed territory, and the Hungarians threatened to do the same. So according to most accounts that I've read, the desperate Czech president turned to Hitler for support, and what was left of the country became a German protectorate. Although anti-German propaganda soon portrayed the loss of Czech independence as a flagrant violation of the Munich Agreement, proof that Hitler couldn't be trusted to keep his promises, the situation was really not so clear-cut, since Czechoslovakia had already fallen apart and no longer existed. Furthermore, the Czechs had only been fully independent for 20 years after having previously spent nearly 700 years under German suzerainty. So in many respects, this merely restored the traditional geopolitical arrangements in that part of Europe, doing so far more peacefully than when the Soviets invaded and occupied the Baltic states the following year. Mike then says, I can't make any sense of Churchill's behavior prior to the war. Why was he so eager to declare war on Germany over a German territorial dispute with Poland, many hundreds of miles away from his own country? Why did he think that that should involve England? To answer this question, Unz consults David Irving's volume, Churchill's War. Churchill was a huge spendthrift who lived lavishly and often far beyond his financial means, employing an army of dozens of personal servants at his large country estate, despite frequently lacking any regular and assured sources of income to maintain them. This predicament naturally put him at the mercy of those individuals willing to support his sumptuous lifestyle in exchange for determining his political activities. And somewhat similar pecuniary means were used to secure the backing of a network of other political figures from across all the British parties, who became Churchill's close political allies. To put things in plain language, during the years leading up to the Second World War, both Churchill and numerous other fellow British MPs were regularly receiving sizable financial stipends, cash bribes, from Jewish and Czech sources in exchange for promoting a policy of extreme hostility towards the German government and actually advocating war. The sums involved were quite considerable, with the Czech government alone probably making payments that amounted to tens of millions of dollars in present-day money to British elected officials, publishers, and journalists working to overturn the official peace treaty of their existing government. A particularly notable instance occurred in early 1938, when Churchill suddenly lost all his accumulated wealth in a foolish gamble on the American stock market, and was soon forced to put his beloved country estate up for sale to avoid personal bankruptcy, only to quickly be bailed out by a foreign Jewish millionaire intent upon promoting a war against Germany. Indeed, the early stages of Churchill's involvement in this sordid behavior are recounted in an Irving chapter aptly entitled The Hired Help. Ironically enough, German intelligence learned of this massive bribery of British parliamentarians and passed the information along to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who was horrified to discover the corrupt motives of his fierce political opponents, but apparently remained too much of a gentleman to have them arrested and prosecuted. I'm no expert in the British laws of that era, but for elected officials to do the bidding of foreigners on matters of war and peace in exchange for huge secret payments seems almost a textbook example of treason to me, and I think that Churchill's timely execution would have saved tens of millions of lives. My impression is that individuals of low personal character are those most likely to sell out the interests of their own country in exchange for large sums of foreign money, and as such usually constitute the natural targets of nefarious plotters and foreign spies. Churchill certainly seems to fall into this category, with rumors of massive personal corruption swirling around him from early in his political career. Later, he supplemented his income by engaging in widespread art forgery, a fact that Roosevelt eventually discovered and probably used as a point of personal leverage against him. Also quite serious was Churchill's constant state of drunkenness, with his inebriation being so widespread as to constitute clinical alcoholism. Indeed, Irving notes that in his private conversations, FDR routinely referred to Churchill as a drunken bum. And to keep the war going against popular sentiment, Unz points out that Churchill used nefarious means. As written by a U.S. military intelligence officer in his memoirs published a half-century later. Great Britain, in violation of all the ethics of civilized warfare that had theretofore been respected by our race, and in treacherous violation of solemnly assumed diplomatic covenants about open cities, had secretly carried out intensive bombing of such open cities in Germany for the express purpose of killing enough unarmed and defenseless men and women to force the German government reluctantly to retaliate and bomb British cities, and thus kill enough helpless British men, women, and children to generate among Englishmen enthusiasm for the insane war to which their government had committed them. It is impossible to imagine a governmental act more vile and more depraved than contriving death and suffering for its own people, for the very citizens whom it was exhorting to loyalty. And I suspect that such an act of such infamous and savage treason would have nauseated even Genghis Khan, or Hulagu, or Tamerlane, Oriental barbarians, universally reprobated for their insane bloodlust. History, so far as I recall, does not record that they ever butchered their own women and children to facilitate lying propaganda. In 1944, members of British military intelligence took it for granted that after the war, Marshal Sir Arthur Harris would be hanged or shot for high treason against the British people. Churchill's ruthless violations of the laws of war regarding urban aerial bombardment directly led to the destruction of many of Europe's finest and most ancient cities. But perhaps influenced by his chronic drunkenness, he later sought to carry out even more horrifying war crimes, and was only prevented from doing so by the dogged opposition of all his military and political subordinates. Along with the laws prohibiting the bombing of cities, all nations had similarly agreed to ban the first use of poison gas, while stockpiling quantities for necessary retaliation. Since Germany was the world leader in chemistry, the Nazis had produced the most lethal forms of new nerve gases, such as tabun and sarin, whose use might have easily resulted in major military victories on both the eastern and western fronts. but Hitler had scrupulously obeyed the international protocols that his nation had signed. However, late in the war during 1944, the relentless Allied bombardment of German cities led to the devastating retaliatory attacks of the V-1 flying bombs against London, and an outraged Churchill became adamant that German cities should be attacked with poison gas in counter-retaliation. If Churchill had gotten his way, many millions of British might soon have perished from German nerve gas counterstrikes. Around the same time, Churchill was also blocked in his proposal to bombard Germany with hundreds of thousands of deadly anthrax bombs, an operation that might have rendered much of Central and Western Europe uninhabitable for generations. Unz also cites another book that came out 3 decades after Irving's 700,000-word epic on Churchill's War. This was called No More Champagne, Churchill and His Money by David Loff. Loff explains that Churchill became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day that German forces began their invasion of the Low Countries and France. But aside from those huge military and political challenges, Britain's new wartime leader also faced an entirely different crisis as well, being unable to cover his personal bills, debt interest, or tax payments, all of which were due at the end of the month, thereby forcing him to desperately obtain a huge secret payment from the same Austrian Jewish businessman who had previously rescued him financially. Stories like this may reveal the hidden side of larger geopolitical developments, which sometimes only come to light many decades later. And last, Mike asks, why was FDR so eager to drag the U.S. into a war that posed no threat to U.S. national security? It seems to me that FDR's decision may have been shaped not by principle, but by the expectation that if the industrial centers of Europe were left in ruins, the U.S. would unavoidably emerge as the lone global superpower. That, of course, turned out to be exactly what happened. But keep in mind, the tipping point Battle of Stalingrad ended in February 1943, whereas D-Day took place in June 1944. What that means is that the United States did not enter the conflict for a whole 16 months after it was certain that Germany would lose the war. In answer, Unz consults John T. Flynn, a 1930s journalist. So according to Flynn's January 1938 account, FDR and his advisors had originally viewed a possible war with Japan as the key to America's economic revival, but they subsequently shifted their focus to a European war against Germany instead, and I think a turning point may have been the widespread Kristallnacht riots against German Jews in November 1938, following the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jewish activist. These attacks outraged the very influential Jewish communities of America and Europe, completely undoing any positive consequences of the Munich Agreement a couple of months earlier, and focused intense international hostility against Hitler's Germany, which had previously worked out reasonably amicable relationships with its small Jewish population while establishing an important economic partnership with the rising Zionist movement. Ironically enough, according to Irving's very detailed reconstruction, Hitler had nothing to do with the anti-Jewish riots and urgently sought to suppress them once they began. Instead, the attacks seem to have been orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, his powerful propaganda minister, who had recently fallen from favor because of his high-profile love affair with a Czech actress, leading to the bitter complaints of his wife, a close friend of Hitler. Goebbels apparently hoped he could use the anti-Jewish riots to restore his influence in the Nazi hierarchy, but they instead had disastrous consequences, thus raising the remarkable possibility that the political fallout from an extramarital affair may have played a crucial role in the outbreak of World War II. So there you have it. The death of millions, the leveling of cities, and a permanent legacy that all is fair in love and war because of the stock market gambling debts and debauchery of a chronic drunk on one hand, and then a philandering propagandist on the other. This is what passes for heroes these days. God help us. To follow up and for another view on the lead up to World War II and FDR, here is Kennedy's Ethics that looks at Joe Kennedy and his objections to the Hollywood Jews who were fomenting war. And then this is a spiritual and philosophical view of Forgiving Hitler, which also includes some more history. Thank you for watching.